Welcome to Learn the Word, the daily Bible teaching program of Calvary Chapel of Delta and Pastor Doug McLean. As we pick up in Matthew 26, verse 75, Pastor Doug is taking us through the 7 contributing factors that led to Peter's denial of Jesus. So let's take a look.
He heard the word and didn't believe it. The second factor that led to this was that Peter was very self-confident, admittedly very courageous. Remember, he was the only one that swung the sword, hacked off the ear of the high priest's servants. He was the one that we're told in this text that had the courage to go to the high priest's courtyard. Very courageous. But human courage will only get you so far. Remember, Jesus said the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So self-confidence was the second factor. The third factor related to that is that Peter thought he was exceptional. And I mean that in the technical use of the word. He was exceptional. He was above the others. He even said it, verse 33, he said, even if all are made to stumble this night, I'll never be made to stumble. So he thought he was an exception. And that can happen to any person in this room, where you can read a warning and you could think, that's for all those people, but it doesn't apply to me. The fourth factor that led to his failure was that Peter failed to watch and pray, as Jesus had instructed in the garden. Remember, he slept. You can see it back in verses 36 to 46. He didn't watch and pray. He couldn't pray an hour. And certainly that was part of his steps to this failure. All right, 5, 6, and 7. They're new this week. Number 5, notice in the text, Peter followed at a distance. Listen, you will struggle as a follower of Jesus Christ if you try to follow at a distance. Because everything you need to follow Jesus is found near to him, connected to him, in him, abiding in him, relying on him, trusting in him. And as soon as you back off and you're not in the Word as much, you come to church less, you're praying less, you're going to have a hard time being loyal to Jesus. And for us, I think it's very germane because we live in a time where it's easier to follow at a distance now than ever before in human history. In the early church, if you wanted to become a follower of Jesus, you didn't have a Bible. You couldn't go to the bookstore and buy a Bible. If you wanted to learn the Word, you had to gather with God's people. You couldn't buy a commentary. You couldn't go online and listen to teachings. If you wanted to follow Jesus, you had to be there. You had to be connected. You had to be there with God's people. And there's something about that accountability and face-to-face learning to deny self, learning to die to self, learning to live for others, learning to live for Jesus, learning to be connected among God's people that is vital to your walk with Jesus Christ. And I'm not saying that all those things are great. It's great that we all have our own Bibles. It's great that we can look things up. It's great that we can watch online when we're not feeling well. It's great that we can connect and listen to teachings all the time, but that is not a substitute for being with the body of Christ. It's vital to your walk with the Lord. I've never seen a person flourish in a relationship with Jesus Christ that backs off from fellowship. I've never seen it. Number 6, Peter tried to blend in. That's a significant factor. If you try to blend in with the world, you're going to face more temptation. Conversely, if when you walk into a new environment, you introduce yourself as a follower of Jesus Christ, a Bible-believing follower of Jesus Christ, I guarantee you There's going to be some temptation that will just not come your way. There's some things that people won't say around you, they won't invite you into. You just right away identify yourself as a follower of Jesus Christ. It protects you. Remember, we're to be holy as he is holy. And to be holy means to be set apart. It means to be distinct. We're different by design. Remember, Jesus said, if the salt loses its saltiness, what good is it? In other words, our value in the world to the world is our distinction. And so it's so important that you maintain that distinction. Peter was trying to blend in, and that led to his fall, his failure. And the seventh thing to note is that Peter tried to preserve himself. He tried to save himself. And of course, all these things are connected. But remember, Jesus said, Matthew 16:25, whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Matthew 16:25. Here's Peter. You know, the fear of man is a snare. Proverbs 29:25. And that's, he's trying to save his life. He's afraid of people. And that's where Peter found himself. So 7 steps that led him to a place where he was sure he'd never, ever get to. He'd never arrive. And he failed here. Now, before we go on, I want you to think about Peter's failure. What failed? I submit to you, if you look at this, Peter's courage failed. His courage failed. I mean, here he's weeping. He's realizing that he wasn't as strong as he thought he was. He had failed the Lord Jesus. He had denied the Lord. In Luke 22:32, Jesus said to Peter, way back when they were still in the city, before they came to Gethsemane, Luke 22:32, he said to Peter, I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. And we'll see his faith didn't fail. His courage failed. His self-confidence failed. He failed in his speech, his witness, his behavior. But Peter still believed. And that's why he was weeping. That's why he was broken here. Because he still believed. And we're going to see Peter's faith was evident in the decisions he made after this. So interesting, you have this contrast between Jesus on trial and kind of Peter's trial, a triumph and a failure. And then we come into chapter 27 and we have another contrast laid out. But first we're told, chapter 27, 1 and 2, when the morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Now, technically, Rome had taken the right to execute capital punishment away from the Jews. I say technically because the Jewish leaders didn't always submit. We know that, for example, in the case of Stephen. They just stoned him to death, Acts chapter 7. But in the case of Jesus, it was convenient for the Jewish leaders to submit to Rome's rule. Because Jesus was still popular among many of the common people, it would serve the Jewish leaders well to have Rome do the dirty work and carry out the execution. So as time goes on, they could say, well, Rome killed him. The challenge for the Jewish leaders was to find a way to get Pilate, the Roman governor, to put Jesus to death. So they came up with their strategy, meeting early in the morning, and the town awoke to this contingent leading Jesus bound and beaten through Jerusalem to the Praetorium to Pilate. Then, verse 3 tells us, then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? You see to it. So Judas saw the results of his betrayal, seeing Jesus condemned, and he was full of remorse. That's a good translation there. Some of your translations might have a different word there, but remorse is an excellent translation there. He brought back the money. He confessed his sin to the chief priest and to the elders. He knew that what he did was wrong. He knew that Jesus was innocent. And as he's confessing to these men, the chief priests and elders said, well, that's your problem. Full of compassion here. Well, that's your problem. Verse 5, then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. That money that had been appealing now repulsed him. So full of guilt and condemnation, he saw no hope, and he went out and took his own life. Please notice he didn't turn to Jesus. He didn't confess his sin to God. You don't see the tears and weeping. Perhaps he did, but we're not told. The condemnation was great, and his efforts to deal with the condemnation, to try to undo his actions, to make a confession to the priests, didn't bring relief. And in desperation, he went out and committed suicide. The devil was so involved in this. Yeah, at first taking advantage of Judas's greed and ambition, inspiring the idea, then actually indwelling Judas for a while. And then after Judas does it, then the devil comes back and condemns him for doing it. That's what the devil does. And then lying to Judas, suggesting that, well, if you just take your life, it would end the guilt, the regret, and the remorse. But that was a lie because it didn't. It didn't. That was just the beginning of an eternity of regret and suffering forever and ever. Judas could have asked God to forgive him at any time. He could have asked Jesus to forgive him. But he never did. And he ended up taking his own life. Listen, guilt, unresolved sin will wreck a person's life. David, after he committed adultery with Bathsheba and then arranged for the murder of Bathsheba's husband to try to cover up his actions, had a season of great guilt. He wrote about it in Psalm 32, verses 3-5. He said this, Psalm 32, 3-5. He said, when I kept silent, my bones grew old through my groaning all the day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was turned into a drought of summer. But then he said, I acknowledge my sin to you, and my iniquity I have not hidden. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. See, David discovered that it was when he finally, it looks like almost a year of trying to hide this, at least 6 months. When he finally got to a place, he said, it's my sin, Lord, forgive me. It was then that he had relief. Judas never did. And he tragically took his own life. And the chief priest that had used him didn't care at all. Look at verse 6. But the chief priest took the silver pieces and said, "It is not lawful to put them in the treasury because they are the price of blood." So they took the money, but didn't put it in the treasury because they had used it to pay for the betrayal, which is another admission that they knew what they did was wrong. They had this principle that if money was gained by sinful activity, that it shouldn't be used for the Lord's work. And they based that off of Deuteronomy 23:18, which is a verse, Deuteronomy 23:18, which says you can't bring the wages of a harlot into the Lord's house. So they had this principle that if it was money that was gained through a sinful activity, that it couldn't be used for the Lord's work. And so here they're applying that principle and saying we can't use this money in the Lord's house. It's blood money. So they took it, but they had to come up with something to do with it. So verse 7 says, "And they consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day." So they took the money and they bought a potter's field. That's the land around a potter's house. Two things you would find there. Usually that would be an area where there would be clay that would be useful for the potter. And also you'd find broken pieces of pottery, broken pots. So the land there around the potter's house would not be useful for cultivation. It wouldn't have any agricultural value. So they bought this piece of land that had no agricultural value to bury people who happened to be in Jerusalem and died. They believed that you would bury them the same day of their death. So if you had strangers visiting, and they always have people visiting in Jerusalem, that this could be a place to bury people who weren't at home if they died in Jerusalem. So that's their use of it. Now, they didn't understand the prophecy that they were fulfilling by doing this. Verse 9 tells us, "Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, whom they of the children of Israel priced, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me." Now, there are some difficulties about these two verses. And the difficulty comes in that Matthew said this was fulfilled, that which was spoken by Jeremiah, but then he quotes some specific things from the prophecy of Zechariah. Zechariah 11:12-13. Now, you read different people about this and you start to find different explanations. One explanation is that, they had scrolls, and one scroll wouldn't contain the whole Bible. And the scroll, they said, of Jeremiah had the minor prophets at the end of it. So by referring to Jeremiah, they're referring to that whole scroll. That's one interpretation. And that may or may not be. But let me develop a thought further. First, I'd like to read to you the prophecy from Zechariah 11:12-13. Zechariah 11:12-13. This is the prophecy. "Then I said to them, if it is agreeable to you, give me my wages, and if not, refrain. So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter. That princely price they set on me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter." So Zechariah, over 400 years before Christ came, prophesied of a price of betrayal and that 30 pieces of silver, and that would ultimately end up with the potter via being thrown into the house of the Lord. So Matthew says this fulfills what was spoken by Jeremiah. Why? Well, you go back and you read Jeremiah, 52 chapters. Read it this afternoon. And you come to chapter 18. And in chapter 18, the Lord told Jeremiah to go to the house of the potter. And Jeremiah watched as something was being made at the wheel. And the vessel was marred in the potter's hand. And the potter then reformed it and made it into something different. And the Lord then explained that if he speaks concerning a nation to destroy it, and the nation turns from its evil, then he would relent and not destroy it. If he spoke something good concerning a nation, and that nation turns and does evil, then he would relent from the good. And the whole point of that passage was he, as the potter, can do something different depending on the way the clay responds to his word or to his hand. Then you come to Jeremiah chapter 19. In Jeremiah chapter 19, the Lord told Jeremiah to take an earthen flask and to take some of the elders and go to a valley outside of Jerusalem and to announce that a catastrophe was coming because of the way they had forsaken God and served other gods. And then in Jeremiah 19, verse 10, God told Jeremiah to break the flask. And he said, they would be broken as one breaks a potter's vessel that cannot be made whole again. And that they would bury the people until there was no room to bury them. Look, the potter's field is a picture of judgment. Broken pottery, a hopeless situation. Oh, there's opportunity while they were still being formed. But when they're hardened, then brokenness comes. Look, listen, it's the potter's field portion of this prophecy, I believe, that Jeremiah spoke about. Buying a worthless field, buying a field full of broken vessels. The potter's field, that field isn't mentioned in the prophecy in Zechariah. The reference to the field is only in Jeremiah. And it's interesting in Jeremiah 32, as you continue to read through, Jeremiah is directed to buy a field that had no value when it was purchased because it was occupied by the enemy. But when he purchased it, it had no value. When he purchased it, it had no use. But one day it would. Look, this is amazing. It truly is. And you think about this, how this fits in. What treachery to take 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. What a waste to throw it away back to the ones from which it came. But then that money was used to buy a field of broken vessels. A place to bury strangers until the resurrection. Look, Judas's betrayal of Jesus led to his death. His death is the means by which we were purchased. We're earthen vessels, designed for a purpose but broken because of our sin. We're damaged, not worth much to the world, but he values us. He paid for us with his precious blood to have us as his own, to do something supernatural in our lives, to resurrect us into newness of life. Look, this is deep, it's profound, it's something to consider. But here, the worst tragedy, terrible treachery, as Jesus was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, that money was used, listen, not by Judas. That money was used not by the Jewish leaders ultimately, but it benefited the potter and it benefited the strangers to fulfill God's purpose. What happened to Jesus fulfilled God's purpose, and it benefited us who were strangers, who were afar off, who were broken vessels that he valued. So listen, there's hope in Jesus. The key is to stay close to him. If you've drifted away, to come back to him. He took your place. He suffered in your stead. He never tried to get out of the situation because it was what was necessary to save you.
Because Jesus went to the cross, there's hope for the broken. And we're going to continue to see that throughout this week as we near the end of the book of Matthew. Until then, if you have any questions about today's program, or you'd like to share a word of encouragement with Pastor Doug, you can write to us at 5911 Delta Road, Delta, PA 17314. Again, you can write to us at 5911 Delta Road, Delta, PA 17314. So that brings us to the end of today's program. But thanks so much for joining us to learn the Word.